this episode, we dive into Karens who got eaten alive by deadly animals. From a wedding anniversary turned bloody after getting too close to a lion, to an educational video that became a murder scene. But let's start with the first story. The afternoon of June 15, 2014 brought perfect golden hour lighting to Kruger National Park, South Africa. For Cheryl Whitfield, 52, a successful Scottsdale real estate agent, this would become her final photo session. Cheryl had booked this expensive private safari tour for her 25th wedding anniversary, spending nearly $20,000 on what she considered a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Having grown up watching nature documentaries and visiting zoos, she felt more prepared for African wildlife than most other tourists, though her actual experience was limited to photographing deer in Arizona state parks. Her safari guide Thabo was a seasoned professional with over 15 years of experience who had initially been impressed by Cheryl's enthusiasm. However, as the day progressed, he grew concerned by her increasing frustration with safety protocols and her tendency to question his expertise. She had already pushed boundaries twice that morning, stepping out of the vehicle briefly for photos despite his warnings. At 4:45 p.m., their vehicle approached a pride of lions resting beneath acacia trees. The magnificent cats were in their element. A dominant male, several females, and cubs scattered in the dappled shade. Cheryl's excitement was palpable as she raised her expensive camera, snapping photos through the open vehicle window while expressing frustration about the distance between them and the lions. Thabo explained that they were already at the optimal distance for both safety and photography, noting that the pride was showing signs of alertness. He pointed out the male's posture and the way several females had lifted their heads, subtle signs that experienced guides learned to read. But Cheryl had spent her career overcoming obstacles and finding solutions when others said something was impossible. Looking at the distance between the vehicle and the lions, she made a calculation that would prove fatal. Her hand moved toward the door handle as she rationalized that her experience with animals and careful approach would keep her safe. African lions are apex predators that have ruled the savannah for millennia. A dominant male can weigh up to 420 pounds and possesses a bite force of over 650 pounds per square inch, powerful enough to crush the skull of a buffalo. When their territory is invaded or they perceive a threat, their predatory instincts override any tolerance they might have developed for human presence. Before Thabo could physically stop her, Cheryl had opened the door and stepped onto the African soil. She moved slowly and deliberately, her camera raised, genuinely believing that her careful approach would keep her safe. She had seen countless nature documentaries where photographers worked near big cats, and she convinced herself that this was no different. The dominant male lion had been resting but was immediately alert to this new development. Lions are territorial animals with finely tuned threat assessment abilities, and the approach of this upright, unfamiliar creature triggered millions of years of evolutionary programming. Cheryl managed to take several photos, feeling vindicated as the lion seemed to tolerate her presence. She called back to the vehicle, expressing her belief that the animals weren't bothered by her presence, and that she had successfully demonstrated that they weren't threatened by her approach. But she had misread the situation entirely. The male's stillness wasn't tolerance. It was the focused attention of a predator, calculating distance and timing. When Cheryl took 2 more steps closer to frame a better shot, she crossed an invisible boundary that the lion had established. The charge came with explosive power that covered 30 yards in under 4 seconds. Cheryl's scream of terror cut through the African air as she realized her fatal miscalculation. But there was no time to run, no time to retreat to the vehicle. The massive predator struck her with devastating force, his powerful jaws clamping down as she was knocked to the ground. Thabo immediately fired warning shots and started the engine, but the lion's predatory instincts had fully engaged. The attack was swift and decisive, lasting less than 2 minutes, but seeming like an eternity to the horrified witnesses. The incident sparked international media attention and led to mandatory vehicle locks on all safari vehicles in South Africa. Cheryl's husband filed the wrongful death lawsuit against the tour company, which was ultimately dismissed when investigators determined that Thabo had followed all proper safety protocols. As the African sun set over Kruger National Park, another tourist was already making plans for her own encounter with a wild predator, this time in America's most famous national park, where a mother bear was teaching her cubs to forage in a meadow that seemed perfectly safe to human eyes. The morning of August 3, 2015 dawned crisp and clear in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. For Tiffany Patterson, 48, a successful Denver marketing executive, this beautiful morning would become her last. Tiffany had arrived at Yellowstone with her family 3 days earlier for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation, but she had grown increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as extensive restrictions. She had already received 2 warnings from rangers, one for approaching elk too closely while trying to get better photos, and one for leaving a designated trail to reach a better viewpoint. Each warning had reinforced her belief that park regulations were overly cautious and designed more for liability protection than actual safety. At 7:20 a.m., while hiking the scenic Fairy Falls Trail with her reluctant family, Tiffany encountered something that would test her confidence in the most brutal way possible. Through a clearing in the dense forest, she spotted a female grizzly bear with 2 small cubs, peacefully foraging for berries in a sun-dappled meadow about 60 yards away. Her first instinct was actually appropriate. She stopped walking and quietly pointed out the bears to her family. For a moment, she stood in genuine awe of the magnificent animals. But as she watched other hikers taking photos from a safe distance with telephoto lenses, Tiffany began to feel frustrated by the limitations of her phone camera. The bears looked tiny in her photos, and she knew her friends back home would be disappointed by the distant, unclear images. She whispered to her husband about getting closer for better photos, but he immediately grabbed her arm and reminded her about the ranger's warnings regarding mother bears with cubs. She paused, genuinely considering his words. The mandatory safety briefing had been clear about the dangers of approaching bears, especially mothers with young. But looking at the peaceful scene in front of her, with the bears calmly foraging and showing no signs of aggression, she convinced herself that the warnings were generic precautions that didn't apply to this specific situation. Grizzly bears are among North America's most formidable predators, with adult females weighing between 200 and 400 pounds and possessing strength that defies imagination. A grizzly's claws can grow up to 4 inches long and are powerful enough to tear through tree bark and dig through frozen ground. But it's their protective instinct toward their cubs that makes them truly deadly. A mother grizzly will attack anything she perceives as a threat to her offspring. Tiffany assured her husband she would be careful and would stop if the bears even looked at her. She pulled out her phone and expressed her desire to capture just one good photo to show people back home. She began walking slowly toward the meadow, genuinely trying to be respectful and non-threatening. Her approach was cautious and deliberate, and for the first 20 yards, the bear seemed unaware of her presence. This reinforced her belief that she was handling the situation correctly. But as she moved within 30 yards of the bear's family, the mother grizzly's head lifted from her foraging. The massive female had been aware of the human presence from the beginning, but had initially chosen to ignore it while keeping herself positioned between the potential threat and her cubs. Tiffany stopped when she saw the bear looking at her, raising her phone to capture what she thought would be the perfect shot. She whispered about how incredible the moment was, not realizing that her voice was carrying across the meadow. The mother grizzly's ears flattened against her skull, a warning sign that Tiffany didn't recognize. The bear took several steps toward her, and Tiffany, instead of backing away, stood her ground and continued taking photos, interpreting the bear's movement as curiosity rather than a threat display. When Tiffany took 3 more steps forward to get an even better angle, the protective mother had seen enough. With a roar that echoed through the forest, she charged at full speed toward the woman who had ignored every warning signal and positioned herself as a threat to her cubs. Grizzly bears can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human could ever hope to run, and this mother was driven by the most powerful force in nature, the need to protect her young. Tiffany's attempt to run triggered the bear's chase instinct, the worst possible response in a grizzly encounter. The attack occurred in a dense forest where her screams were muffled by towering pines. Despite the immediate response from park rangers who had been monitoring the area due to recent bear activity, Tiffany sustained fatal injuries from an animal that was simply following millions of years of evolutionary programming to protect her offspring. Tiffany's death led to the most comprehensive overhaul of Yellowstone's visitor safety protocols in the park's history. Her family filed a federal lawsuit against the National Park Service, which was ultimately settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. While Tiffany's death became a stark reminder that dangerous wild animals are animals you should not take for granted, another woman was about to learn it the hard way with one of Earth's most ancient predators. The evening of March 12, 2016 brought spectacular sunset conditions to KARENS, Queensland, Australia. For Bethany Rodriguez, 44, a successful insurance claim manager from Phoenix, Arizona, this would become her final swim. Bethany had arrived at the upscale resort 3 days earlier with sky-high expectations and an attitude that had already made her notorious among the staff. As someone who prided herself on always getting her way through persistence and complaints, she had spent every moment since arrival demanding upgrades, special treatment, and access to areas that other guests simply accepted as off-limits. Her husband Mark had grown increasingly embarrassed by her behavior, watching helplessly as she berated housekeeping staff for not providing enough towels, demanding that the restaurant kitchen prepare meals that weren't on the menu, and insisted that the concierge personally escort her to every activity. The main pool situation had become her first major battleground. When she complained loudly to the pool attendant about children splashing near her, demanding they be moved to a different area, she was politely told that the pool was open to all guests. This response triggered her immediate escalation to the manager, where she spent 20 minutes explaining her status as a premium guest and her expectation of adult-only pool time. When that failed, she turned her attention to the beach access, arguing with lifeguards about the designated swimming areas and insisting that the roped-off sections were just suggestions rather than actual boundaries. She had already been warned twice about swimming outside the safe zone, each time responding with lectures about her swimming abilities and her rights as a paying customer. But it was the beautiful secluded lagoon visible from her balcony that became her obsession. She had approached the staff multiple times, each interaction becoming more heated as she was repeatedly told the area was completely off limits due to wildlife dangers. She had cornered the resort manager that morning, demanding to know exactly what wildlife posed such a threat that paying guests couldn't access what was clearly part of the resort property. When told about saltwater crocodiles, she had laughed dismissively and pulled out her phone to show him statistics about crocodile attacks, explaining that she had done her research and knew the actual risks were minimal. The area in question was a pristine mangrove lagoon, separated from the resort by multiple barriers and warning signs. Danger signs were posted in English, Japanese, and German, along with detailed explanations about the saltwater crocodiles that inhabited these waters. At 6:30 p.m., as the golden hour light began to fade, Bethany made her move. She had changed into her most expensive swimsuit and brought her waterproof phone to document what she planned to present as evidence of the resort's excessive caution. She found a section where the fencing had been damaged by recent storms, creating a gap that allowed access without actually breaking any physical barriers. Saltwater crocodiles are among the world's most efficient predators, virtually unchanged by millions of years of evolution. These apex predators can grow up to 23 feet in length and weigh over a ton, with a bite force of 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any living animal. She floated peacefully for nearly 10 minutes, watching tropical birds in the mangrove canopy above and composing the triumphant social media posts she would share. What Bethany didn't know was that a 14-foot saltwater crocodile had been hunting in the deeper sections of the lagoon when she entered the water. The massive reptile had detected her presence immediately through vibrations in the water and had been slowly positioning itself for an optimal attack angle. The attack came without warning, a sudden, violent eruption of water as the crocodile launched himself from the depths with explosive force. Bethany's scream was cut short as massive jaws clamped down with crushing power, and the water churned violently as the predator executed his death roll, a technique perfected over millions of years of evolution. Within moments, the lagoon returned to an eerie calm, broken only by ripples that quickly faded in the evening breeze. Resort security, alerted by guests who had heard Bethany's brief scream and the violent churning of water, found only her belongings on the shore and her phone floating in the lagoon, still recording her final moments. Bethany's death triggered the largest tourism safety investigation in Queensland's history. Her husband filed a massive lawsuit resulting in a $12 million settlement, the largest tourism-related payout in Australian history. The settlement led to mandatory crocodile proofing of all resort properties within 50 kilometers of known crocodile habitats, costing the tourism industry over $200 million in infrastructure upgrades. Yet, as the tropical sun set over the mangrove lagoons of Queensland, another entitled tourist was already planning her own confrontation with one of nature's deadliest predators, this time in the mountains of Washington State, where a corporate trainer's superiority complex would be tested by a predator that recognized no human authority. The afternoon of July 28, 2017 brought ideal hiking conditions to Olympic National Park, Washington. For Heather Thompson, 50, a successful corporate trainer from Seattle, this would become her final opportunity to prove her superiority over what she considered incompetent government bureaucrats and their ridiculous safety regulations. Heather had built her business on the premise that she knew better than everyone else how to provide authentic wilderness experiences. Her corporate retreats were marketed specifically to executives and professionals who were tired of being treated like children by overly cautious park services and tour operators. She was leading 8 office colleagues on what she had designed as an elite leadership retreat, constantly reminding them that they were getting an experience that went far beyond what ordinary tourists received. Her group consisted of accountants, marketing professionals, and middle managers who had paid premium prices for what Heather promised would be an authentic wilderness challenge. From the moment they arrived at Olympic National Park, Heather had been vocal about her disdain for what she called government overreach in wilderness management. She had spent the entire drive to the trailhead explaining to her guests how park rangers were typically inexperienced college graduates who had never actually spent serious time in real wilderness situations, unlike herself. The trouble began when they reached the official trailhead and encountered fresh warnings about recent black bear activity in the area. Multiple signs warned hikers to stay on designated trails, make noise while hiking, and report any bear sightings immediately. Heather's reaction was immediate and predictable. She rolled her eyes dramatically and launched into one of her signature lectures about government incompetence. She gathered her group around her and began explaining, in her most condescending tone, how these warnings were typical examples of bureaucratic overreach designed to keep people dependent on guided tours and official programs. She made sure her clients understood that following these restrictive warnings would mean missing out on the authentic leadership experience they had paid premium prices to receive. 5:15 p.m., after delivering another lecture about how real outdoor professionals like herself knew how to assess actual risks versus bureaucratic paranoia, Heather made the decision to take her group onto an unmarked trail. When they encountered fresh black bear tracks and scat on the trail, Heather's response was entirely predictable. She gathered her nervous clients around the evidence and began another impromptu lecture about how this was exactly the kind of thing that would send less qualified guides running back to the safety of designated trails. Black bears are North America's most common bear species, typically weighing between 200 and 400 pounds, but capable of reaching 600 pounds during peak feeding season. While generally more timid than grizzlies, black bears become extremely aggressive when defending food sources or feeling cornered. A 250-pound male black bear had been feeding in a rich berry patch nearby, building up the fat reserves he would need to survive the coming winter hibernation. When he heard the loud, confident voice of Heather explaining bear behavior to her group, particularly her dismissive comments about park ranger competence, his defensive instincts immediately activated. The encounter happened suddenly but not without warning. The bear emerged from dense undergrowth about 40 yards ahead of the group, clearly agitated by their presence in his territory during the critical feeding season. Instead of immediately implementing proper bear safety protocols, Heather saw this as the perfect teaching moment to demonstrate her superior wilderness expertise. She positioned herself between the bear and her clients, speaking in what she believed was an authoritative tone about proper bear encounter techniques. She explained to her terrified group that this was exactly the kind of authentic wildlife experience that made her services superior to sanitized park tours. For several tense minutes, the standoff continued. The bear showed classic defensive behavior, huffing, jaw-popping, and making short bluff charges that stopped well short of the group. But instead of recognizing these as serious escalation warnings, Heather treated them as validation of her expertise, continuing to lecture her clients about bear behavior and wilderness leadership principles. Her voice grew louder and more authoritative as she demonstrated what she called proper bear dominance techniques, completely misreading the animal's increasingly agitated state. She explained that the bear was simply testing their resolve and that maintaining confident leadership would cause him to retreat. The situation deteriorated rapidly when one of her clients, panicked by the bear's increasingly aggressive bluff charges, broke from the group and ran. This triggered the bear's chase instinct, and the 250-pound predator immediately pursued the fleeing human. Heather, still convinced of her expertise, ran toward the bear while shouting instructions about proper bear encounter techniques. The bear, now fully committed to protecting his territory, turned on Heather with the full force of an animal that recognized no human authority or self-proclaimed expertise. Her final moments were spent discovering that her superiority complex and dismissive attitude towards safety warnings had not actually made her the wilderness expert she believed herself to be. The attack occurred in a thick forest during the bear's peak foraging time. While her sacrifice did allow her fleeing client to escape, and her group's panic screaming eventually drove the bear away, Heather sustained injuries that proved fatal, despite immediate first aid attempts and rapid evacuation by helicopter rescue teams. Heather's death resulted in the most significant changes to commercial wilderness guiding regulations in Washington state history, ironically implementing exactly the kind of government oversight she had spent her career opposing. Her corporate training business was continued by her business partner, who transformed it into a wilderness safety education company that now emphasizes the importance of respecting both wildlife and the expertise of Park Service professionals. As the Pacific Northwest forest settled into evening quiet, another story of human miscalculation was already unfolding, this time in Oklahoma, where a woman's genuine love of animals would lead her into a fatal encounter with a predator whose wild instincts remained unchanged, despite years in captivity. The afternoon of November 5, 2013 brought unreasonably warm weather to rural Oklahoma. For Stephanie Stevens, 46, a successful pharmaceutical sales representative from Atlanta, this would become her final volunteer session. Stephanie had discovered a genuine love for wildlife conservation and had been volunteering at a small roadside zoo facility for over a year, contributing both time and substantial financial support to help care for rescued exotic animals. Unlike many roadside operations, this facility focused on education and rescue rather than entertainment. Her pharmaceutical background had proven valuable to the facility. She understood animal medications and had helped establish better veterinary care protocols. Her social media presence had gradually shifted toward wildlife education as she learned more about conservation challenges. The facility owner, David, had initially been grateful for Stephanie's expertise and financial support. She had helped fund improved enclosures, better veterinary care, and educational programs. However, as her involvement deepened, She had begun requesting increased access to the animals for educational content creation, pushing against safety protocols that David knew were essential. Her relationship with Raja, the facility's Bengal tiger, had developed over months of careful interaction through barriers. She had studied tiger behavior extensively and had created educational content that helped people understand the complexity of big cat behavior and the challenges of caring for these magnificent predators in captivity. At 3:45 p.m., Stephanie arrived for what she planned as a routine volunteer session, but she had been increasingly frustrated by the limitations on her ability to create the kind of educational content she believed could make a real difference in wildlife conservation awareness. Her social media following had grown substantially, and she felt the responsibility to provide increasingly engaging content. As they walked toward Raja's enclosure, Stephanie brought up her ideas for an educational video series with David. She expressed her belief that her followers were responding well to the tiger content, and they could reach more people by showing more authentic interactions with the animals. Bengal tigers are among the world's most powerful predators, with males weighing up to 660 pounds and possessing a bite force of over 1,000 pounds per square inch. Their canine teeth can grow up to 3 inches long, perfectly designed for puncturing the thick hide of large prey, while their retractable claws can extend up to 4 inches and are sharp enough to tear through muscle and bone with ease. Despite their beauty and apparent calm in captivity, tigers retain all the instincts of apex predators. Stephanie suggested working in the secondary area that day, referring to the space where food was prepared, separated from Raja's primary habitat by reinforced barriers. She proposed filming educational content about feeding protocols and tiger nutrition, emphasizing that it wouldn't be different from what they had done before. David hesitated. The secondary area was technically safe. It had been designed for exactly this kind of educational work, with multiple barriers between humans and the tiger. Stephanie had worked in that space before without incident, and her educational content had genuinely helped people understand the complexities of tiger care and conservation. Against his better judgment, influenced by Stephanie's track record and genuine expertise, David agreed to allow her into the secondary enclosure area. It was a decision based on trust built over months of successful collaboration, but it failed to account for the subtle changes in Raja's behavior. Stephanie entered the secondary area with her camera equipment, genuinely excited about creating content that would help people understand the daily realities of caring for a tiger in captivity. Raja watched her movements with what appeared to be his usual calm interest, showing no obvious signs of agitation. She began explaining to her camera about the meal preparation area, describing how much planning went into feeding a tiger properly, and educating viewers about the complexities involved in proper tiger nutrition and care. Raja's amber eyes tracked her movements with the calculated gaze that marked him as an apex predator. Tigers are solitary animals with an acute sense of territory, and subtle changes in their environment or routine can trigger responses that even experienced handlers don't always anticipate. The fatal moment came when Stephanie, focused on her educational presentation, moved closer to the primary barrier than she had ever done before. She wasn't being reckless. She was simply trying to get a better camera angle to show the feeding setup. But to Raja, her proximity to his primary territory during his afternoon rest period triggered instincts that have been suppressed but never eliminated by years in captivity. The tiger's response was instantaneous. His massive paw struck through the barrier with lightning speed, his claws extending to their full length as he grabbed Stephanie's arm. The attack triggered every alarm system in the facility as David activated emergency protocols. But Raja's size and power made immediate intervention extremely difficult. By the time they managed to secure Raja and reach Stephanie, she had sustained injuries that proved fatal, despite immediate medical attention and rapid transport to a trauma center. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes, but it demonstrated the awesome power of an apex predator whose wild instincts remained unchanged despite years of careful handling. Stephanie's death became the catalyst for the most comprehensive federal investigation of exotic animal facilities in U.S. history. David faced federal charges for operating without proper permits and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The facility was permanently closed, and all animals were relocated to accredited sanctuaries. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.